Hey everyone, welcome to Asylums Uncovered, where we discuss the influence and impact of state hospitals on American history and the void left in their absence. Have you ever wondered what life in an asylum was like? How did the patients get admitted? Who were the people providing their care? We will explore these questions and more in this episode. In our first episode, I did an overview of how the mentally ill were taken care of prior to state institutions being constructed across the country, specifically to care for them. I also talked about the Kirkbride Plan and Dr. Kirkbride. I will link that below in the description if you haven't seen it or want a refresher, because I am going to reference the Kirkbride Asylums quite a few times and base most of my timeline around them. I thought it would be important to do another general overview video to answer the questions like, who were the patients, nurses, and doctors? What was life like in an asylum? How did people get committed? So starting in the mid-19th century and throughout the years, the answer to these questions greatly varied. Specifics to these answers could also differ hospital to hospital, so this is going to be a general overview of these topics. It's very important to understand that if you were committed to a state institution in the mid-1800s, you did not leave. Patients were institutionalized and lived at the hospital 24/7. It's not like today where you live at home and you only go to a facility to seek treatment or therapy. In fact, the nurses and the hospital superintendent also lived there. Every day was living and working together. In future years, patients were often granted access to leave the facility to take field trips into town, of course, with the expectation that they would return. As I've previously mentioned in the last episode, state hospitals built on the Kirkbride Plan were constructed solely for the patient's betterment. Originally, these institutions didn't really believe in things like restraints or the quintessential straitjacket, so the patients were mostly free to roam the halls and day areas. It truly was intended to be a relaxing resort atmosphere. There were wards for violent patients, and they obviously did not have the privilege to roam around, but the overall intent was that the insane could still enjoy life's luxuries. Imagine hallways painted bright yellows, pinks, and blues, and the furnishings were all ornate Victorian decor. In the case of many state hospitals, there may have been workshops and farms where the patients could work as a form of therapy. Then, starting as early as the late 1800s, some even had recreational activities like their own band, orchestras, baseball teams that included both the staff and patients, bowling alleys, and hair salons. There were a lot of different activities that the patients could partake in. Some institutions even hosted local community events. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia actually hosted the local prom in their auditorium. So imagine you're in high school and you're going to prom and you roll up to the local asylum. I mean, I wouldn't hate it, but I can see how some people might find that a little unsettling. But the reality is, architecturally, it was the most impressive building in the area. Throughout the years, treatments evolved, institutions became overcrowded and underfunded, and the large Kirkbride asylums became obsolete. As they entered the 1900s, state hospitals moved towards a cottage plan, which was a campus with multiple buildings versus one giant building. These buildings separated the patients by classification. Generally, there was an administration building, a forensics building reserved for the criminally insane, a geriatrics building for senior patients, a tuberculosis building outfitted with solariums, a men's building, a women's building, and they were usually all connected by an underground tunnel system. And I'm not talking crawl space, small little tunnels, I'm talking hospital hallway tunnels, and this allowed for easier transport of both supplies and patients during the winter months. With the emergence of the cottage plan, the dynamics and daily life inside the asylum changed. There was now separation between staff and patients and the patients themselves. The plan saw nurses and superintendents moving out of the traditional main building, so nurses would often seek off-site housing or they would live in a dedicated on-site nurse dormitory, and the superintendents found themselves moving into large, quite impressive homes on campus. Since state hospitals first opened their doors, patients were admitted from all walks of life: men, women, children, and they were all ages. It wasn't uncommon for the elderly who didn't have anyone to take care of them to go to an asylum, sign some papers to commit themselves, and then live there until they died. So on one hand, you have the elderly committing themselves, and then on the other hand, you had parents dumping their kids off. In the case of a place like Pennhurst State School, for example, it opened in 1908 solely for children who were often developmentally disabled and usually wards of the state. So this meant their parents just didn't want them and they would just drop them off at Pennhurst. See you later, don't want to take care of you, bye forever. In the mid 1800s, early 1900s, it didn't take much to be committed to an asylum, which is actually really scary looking back on it. Husbands could just drop their wives off and have her committed against her will. Parents could just drop their children off if they didn't want them. But men were also committed against their will, and this was usually by families who conspired against them. It was pretty rare that they would ever get out once they were in. Thankfully, today things have evolved and standards are much higher in regard to being committed to a state institution. And today, where I live in Florida, we do have the Baker Act. This is a law that allows families, law enforcement, and healthcare providers to pursue emergency mental health services for someone displaying signs of mental illness who might be a danger to themselves or others. A person is placed on a 72-hour hold and undergoes an involuntary mental health examination. Although it may be called something different, other states do have similar laws and processes. There are measures and criteria that need to be met to institutionalize someone involuntarily, which is very, very different than over 100 years ago. According to the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, here were some reasons for admission in the 1800s. Kicked in the head by a horse, laziness, novel reading, asthma, and epilepsy. There were many more outlandish reasons for admissions, but these are a few of the crazier ones. Today, you wouldn't see anyone committed to a state institution for these reasons, so I think that shows how far we've come in understanding mental illness and raising the standards for such commitment. Throughout the years, treatments have improved and changed. What may seem barbaric now was really just a method of the time. In the 1800s, common treatments were restraints, straitjackets, being locked in a cage, and one of my personal favorites, the tranquilizing chair. So at the time, it was thought that inflammation of the brain caused mental illness. So by strapping the patient to a chair and placing a box over their head, it was thought to slow their pulse, reduce the blood flow to the brain, and alleviate the inflammation. It would make them tranquil. I'm not sure about you, but if I was being strapped to a chair and having a box put over my head, it would probably make me the opposite of tranquil. It kind of sounds like something out of the movie Saw. I don't know, it just sounds weird, right? The 1900s saw the introduction to more chemical interventions, and perhaps the most notable being insulin coma therapy. This was injecting patients with large doses of insulin to induce hypoglycemia and put them in a coma. The hope was that the coma would essentially shock the psychosis out. This would occur daily over many weeks and sometimes months. This treatment is most well known in the case of John Nash, who was the brilliant mathematician that lived with paranoid schizophrenia, whose life was the inspiration for the movie A Beautiful Mind. Nash underwent several weeks of insulin coma therapy at Trenton State Hospital in New Jersey, which of course was the first institution built following the Kirkbride plan. Other popular treatments at this time were electroshock therapy, hydrotherapy, and the most invasive procedure to date, the lobotomy. Now, if that got you excited and you're interested to know more, rest assured, most of these will have their own episodes. I personally cannot wait to talk about Dr. Walter Freeman and the lobotomy. I have read his biography, I think 3 times now. I own it. It's a book called The Lobotomist. If you haven't read it or you don't own it, go to Amazon, read this book. Every time I read it, each time I'm like, my God, Freeman was... he's such an interesting person. I don't want to get too much in the weeds with that because I will cover that in a separate episode, but the lobotomy, obviously, everyone has heard of the lobotomy. In the 1950s, chlorpromazine, or more commonly known as thorazine, came along and totally changed the way asylums functioned. Thorazine is an antipsychotic medication that works to regulate the dopamine in your brain. It balances your mood, and it's often used for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. With this medication, patients no longer needed inpatient treatment and stay full-time at the asylum. They could now take the medicine, live at home, and function in society. State hospitals had become so overcrowded, understaffed, and underfunded that thorazine seemed like an easy answer to alleviate these issues. This eventually led to deinstitutionalization, where patients were moved from state facilities either back home or into the private sector, and then the state hospital would be closed or partially closed. This caused major issues for the patients and staff alike. So many patients had become homeless because the state hospital was the only home they ever knew, and now they had nowhere to go. Nurses and physicians now had to look for work elsewhere. The hospital was one of the main employers in the area, so the economic impact of its closure hit local communities particularly hard. Take the example of Detroit, where factories and plants provided so many jobs. And once they closed, the effects on the area were devastating. So over the 100 years from the 1850s to the 1950s, the shift in hospital operations changed greatly. It went from being committed to the asylum and staying there 24/7 to now people could function in society, live at home, and see a doctor when needed. Of course, there were still more severe cases that did require a patient to be institutionalized. So who were the nurses and doctors? Let's start with the nurses. Moving into the 20th century, many nurses were students training to become a registered nurse. At the time, nurses in both general and psychiatric hospitals took the same exam and would earn the same credentials as an RN. Today, nurses working in a state hospital can still be an RN, but they need to have specialized mental health training. Some may choose to further their education and become a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner. Asylum superintendents knew that training schools in a general hospital setting greatly improved the quality of care and wanted to use that same model for their psychiatric hospitals. Through these training programs, nurses were assigned to work on particular wards, so they were interacting and caring for the same patients every day, becoming familiar with them, and building relationships, whether that was good or bad. As of today, it's hard to say for sure how that affected the quality of care in larger institutions, but in smaller and private facilities, these programs actually had a substantial positive effect. Nurses were not just women, so unlike general hospitals, these training programs in a psychiatric facility were not only open to men, but they highly encouraged them to join. In addition to nurses being responsible for their regular duties and assisting the tending physician, they were also the housekeepers of the asylum. So this meant scrubbing floors, toilets, and taking care of whatever cleaning duties needed to be done. A general day for a nurse at this time was to wake up first thing in the morning, tend to the patients, getting them bathed and dressed, and completing the housekeeping. Some nurses would also supervise the patients as they worked on the farms or in a workshop. I really want to emphasize that this job was by no means easy. It was mentally and physically taxing. It was often reported that female patients were the most dangerous, and at some institutions, nurses actually had to walk in pairs or even groups and always be on the lookout for attacks. There are actual documented cases of nurses actually being killed by the patients. The head nurse would take care of any administrative paperwork to document any supplies needed, any accidents with the patients, or any destroyed property. In the evening, the night shift would come on board, and the day shift nurses would head to bed, only to begin the same routine the very next day. The pay for nurses was low and living conditions weren't great. So as I mentioned, they did live in the hospital. After working all day, they would retire to their rooms, which were usually in one of the asylum wards. They had no separation from their job, the patients, or the asylum itself. Most of the nurses had to lock their doors at night to prevent any patients from getting in, but fortunately they did have a little separation in breathing room once a separate nurse dormitory was built. So I do want to call out a cool little piece of information at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. If you've ever considered going there and doing a tour, I highly recommend it. I've done a ton of historic tours there, but there used to be a former nurse by the name of Sue who was a historic tour guide there, and her tours were awesome. It was really cool because Sue would give you firsthand stories and accounts of actually working at the asylum, and it's just another layer of history and just really cool stuff. So if you're going to Tala to do a tour, ask if Sue still works there. I'm not sure. I haven't done a tour there in about a year or so. Now let's discuss the physicians. So asylum superintendents were the head physician at the facility. They were generally men and they had great prestige and power. Being a doctor in an asylum was not as competitive as a family practice, so many doctors took the route of caring for the insane. Superintendents were usually appointed to the role by a board of directors, and they brought their own philosophies on mental illness and treatments. They set the tone and they decided how their institution was run. In the last episode, I gave the example of Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride being appointed to the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane as the first superintendent, and he brought along his philosophy of moral treatment. Most superintendents around this time also embraced the empathetic view of moral treatment. In fact, it's been reported that they would even dine and socialize with the patients. Every year, state hospitals produced an annual report that provided a breakdown of its finances, patient population, staff, goals, and needs. Superintendents were required by law to provide the statistics included in this report. For patient populations, data such as number of admissions and discharges, age, reason for admission, and cause of insanity were all listed. And get this, in the 1874 annual report for the South Carolina Lunatic Asylum, here are some reasons for admission: childbirth, old age, death of a mother or father, masturbation, and lactation. And no, not necessarily at the same time. Also included in this report were staffing numbers and salaries, facility successes, failures, and future recommendations. Superintendents were usually paid very well and had nice living conditions. Early on, they had living quarters in the main hospital building and would eventually move to a separate superintendent's house on campus. These houses were usually large, two-story, and boasted beautiful, elaborate architecture. Living and working conditions for nurses and physicians drastically changed in the 1930s with an economic crisis and the start of World War II. Between state budget cuts and the war effort, nurses and doctors looked for work elsewhere. Many doctors looked to work in general hospitals treating psychiatric patients, and many moved to outpatient clinics or private practice. Now, even though there were good intentions and some positives, there were very dark times at these institutions, and I think to turn a blind eye to that or pretend like it didn't happen would be doing a severe injustice to the people and the history. There are many reported cases of abuse, mostly physical and sexual, against the patients. When you had staff and patients in such close quarters, it gave abusers access to easy targets. What you have to keep in mind is a lot of these patients were physically handicapped. They may have been deaf or blind, but regardless, they were totally helpless in defending themselves. Also, with the staff having the stress of being overcrowded and understaffed, some patients weren't taken care of at all, and they were basically left rotting in their own feces, urine. They may not have been fed or taken care of for days. For instance, in the court case of Terry Halderman versus Pennhurst, the facility was shut down in 1987 because of the severe abuse that Terry endured while a patient there. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail about this or go into the rabbit hole too deep because I will do a separate episode on Pennhurst, but I wanted to give this as a documented example of severe abuse. Again, even though some people had good intentions, there were good nurses, there were good doctors, and some state hospitals were constructed solely to help the patients. This was not always the case, and I do want to acknowledge that. I hope this gave you a little more insight into what life was like in the asylum and who were the people inside. If you or a family member have any firsthand experience either working or even being a patient in an institution, personally, I would love to hear your story. Thank you all for tuning in, and until next time.